London, 1814. Lady Beatrice Ashworth had endured enough marriage proposals from boring suitors to last a lifetime, but nothing could have prepared her for the scandalous wager she overheard at Almack's most glittering ball. The notorious Duke of Ravensholm, Sebastian Blackwood, stood before his circle of rakish friends making the most outrageous declaration she had ever witnessed. "Give me a kiss, and I'll make you my wife," he proclaimed with insufferable arrogance, choosing her as his target to prove any wallflower could be conquered within a month. What he never expected was for the sharp-tongued daughter of an earl to march directly to his honourable younger brother and plant a passionate kiss on Gabriel's lips instead. Announcing to the stunned assembly that she had given Sebastian his requested kiss through proxy and now demanded he fulfill his promise of marriage. The crystal chandeliers of Almack's cast their golden glow across London's most exclusive assembly rooms, illuminating the cream of society as they waltzed through what promised to be the season's most memorable evening. Lady Beatrice Ashworth stood near the refreshment table, her emerald silk gown modest yet elegant, watching the swirling kaleidoscope of dancers with the practiced eye of someone who had observed rather than participated in such spectacles for far too many seasons. At 23, she possessed what polite society termed adequate beauty, her chestnut hair arranged in fashionable ringlets, her hazel eyes bright with intelligence that often proved more intimidating than attractive to potential suitors. Her stepmother, Lady Margaret Ashworth, hovered nearby like a bird of prey, her sharp gaze constantly surveying the room for eligible gentlemen who might overlook Beatrice's unfortunate tendency toward sharp retorts and unconventional opinions. "Beatrice, you must make more effort tonight," Lady Margaret hissed under her breath, her fan fluttering with agitation. "Lord Reginald has been most attentive these past weeks, and your father grows weary of your continued refusal of perfectly acceptable offers. The thought of Lord Reginald Thornbury, with his perpetually damp palms and tedious discussions of his extensive collection of butterflies, made Beatrice's stomach turn. She had endured 3 lengthy conversations about the mating habits of various Lepidoptera species and felt quite certain she would rather remain a spinster than subject herself to a lifetime of such scintillating discourse. "I fear Lord Reginald's butterflies hold more charm than their collector." "Stepmother," Beatrice replied, with a sweetness that barely concealed her irritation. "Perhaps we might seek a gentleman who can discuss topics beyond the wingspan of dead insects." Lady Margaret's face flushed with mortification as she glanced around to ensure no one had overheard such an improper assessment of a peer of the realm. "Your impertinence will be your ruin, Beatrice. Mark my words, you shall find yourself quite alone if you continue to dismiss every gentleman who shows you favour." The familiar lecture was interrupted by a commotion near the card-room doors, where a group of London's most notorious rakes had gathered around a tall, devastatingly handsome man whose very presence seemed to command attention from every corner of the ballroom. Lord Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravensholm, stood at the centre of the circle, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight, his perfectly tailored evening clothes emphasizing broad shoulders and an athletic frame that spoke of hours spent fencing and riding rather than lounging in gentlemen's clubs. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, whispers of scandalous liaisons, broken hearts, and a complete disregard for social conventions that somehow only enhanced his appeal among the town's most sought-after beauties. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Beatrice found herself drawn closer to the group, her curiosity piqued by the animated discussion taking place. She positioned herself behind a convenient pillar, close enough to hear their conversation while remaining unobserved. "Come now, Ravensholm," Lord Pemberton was saying, his words slightly slurred from too much brandy. Surely you cannot claim that any woman would succumb to your charms within a matter of weeks. Some of these wallflowers have been firmly planted along the walls for entire seasons without so much as a second glance from any gentleman. Sebastian's laugh was rich and confident, the sound of a man who had never known defeat in matters of the heart. My dear Pemberton, you underestimate both my abilities and the susceptibility of the supposedly untouchable spinsters of London society. Given 1 month, I could have any lady in this room professing her undying love and begging for my hand in marriage. The boastful declaration drew snickers and murmurs of disbelief from his companions, while Beatrice felt her temper rising at his casual dismissal of women he deemed beneath his notice. Lord Whitfield, a portly gentleman known more for his gambling debts than his wit, leaned forward with obvious relish. "Prove it then, Your Grace. Choose one of these forgotten flowers and demonstrate your legendary powers of seduction. We shall wager £500 that you cannot accomplish such a feat within the month." Sebastian's gaze swept the ballroom with predatory interest, cataloguing the various ladies present with the calculating assessment of a hunter selecting his prey. His eyes paused momentarily on several young women before moving on, clearly finding them too easy or too obvious for his purposes. When his attention settled on Beatrice's general direction, she pressed herself more firmly against the pillar, her heart racing with a mixture of indignation and unwelcome fascination. "There," he announced with theatrical flourish, pointing directly toward where she stood hidden, "that lovely creature in the emerald gown who believes herself so cleverly concealed. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, if I am not mistaken, daughter of the Earl of Ashworth, and possessor of a tongue sharp enough to slice through a gentleman's pride like a blade through silk. She has refused every suitor presented to her these past 3 seasons and considers herself quite above the common desires that motivate lesser mortals. The perfect challenge for a man of my considerable talents." The group of gentlemen turned to observe Beatrice, who realized with growing horror that her hiding place had been thoroughly compromised. Sebastian stepped forward with the fluid grace of a man supremely confident in his own appeal, his blue eyes gleaming with amusement as he executed a perfect bow in her direction. The entire assembly seemed to hold its breath as he raised his voice to ensure his words carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. "Give me a kiss, Lady Beatrice, and I shall make you my wife." The declaration rang through the air like a shot, causing gasps and shocked murmurs from the assembled company, while Beatrice stood frozen in mortification and fury. She could see Lady Margaret's face drain of all colour, could hear the whispered comments beginning to spread through the crowd like wildfire, could feel the weight of hundreds of curious stares as she remained rooted to her spot behind the pillar. Sebastian's friends erupted in laughter at his audacious public display, clearly considering this the height of entertainment, while the Duke himself wore an expression of supreme satisfaction at having created such a delicious scandal. The sheer arrogance of the man, to treat her as nothing more than a pawn in his juvenile games, to reduce her to a jest for the amusement of his dissolute companions, ignited a rage so intense that Beatrice felt as though she might spontaneously combust from the force of her indignation. She stepped from behind the pillar with her chin held high, her hazel eyes blazing with a fury that should have warned any sensible man to retreat immediately, but Sebastian merely smiled wider as she approached, clearly anticipating either a humiliating rejection or a swooning acceptance that would cement his reputation as London's most irresistible rake. Neither response, however, had prepared him for what happened next. At that precise moment, the ballroom doors opened to admit a latecomer whose presence immediately shifted the attention of the assembled guests. Lord Gabriel Blackwood entered with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, his military bearing evident in the straightness of his shoulders and the measured pace of his stride. Where his elder brother Sebastian was all dangerous charm and calculated seduction, Gabriel possessed a quieter appeal that drew second glances rather than immediate swooning. His brown hair was slightly tousled from the evening breeze, his uniform perfectly pressed, but bearing the subtle signs of a man who had seen real service rather than merely purchased a commission for show. The brothers shared similar features, but where Sebastian's face held the sharp planes of a predator, Gabriel's countenance suggested strength, tempered by genuine kindness, and his green eyes held none of his brother's calculating assessment of the world around him. He paused at the entrance, clearly surprised by the unusual silence that had fallen over what should have been a lively social gathering, his gaze moving from face to face until it settled on the extraordinary tableau before him. Beatrice saw her opportunity and seized it with the desperation of a drowning woman grasping for salvation, her mind working with crystalline clarity despite the chaos of her emotions. Without hesitation or explanation, she crossed the remaining distance between herself and Gabriel with swift, purposeful steps, her emerald skirts rustling with the urgency of her movement. The assembled company watched in stunned fascination as she reached the bewildered military officer, rose gracefully onto her tiptoes, and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was neither tentative nor apologetic, but rather a declaration of war against his brother's insufferable presumption. The ballroom erupted in gasps, shocked exclamations, and the flutter of hundreds of fans as London society witnessed what would undoubtedly become the scandal of the season. Gabriel, though clearly taken aback by this unprecedented assault upon his person, found himself responding to the soft pressure of her lips against his hands instinctively rising to steady her waist as she leaned into him with surprising boldness. When Beatrice finally stepped back, her cheeks flushed with equal parts embarrassment and triumph, she turned to face Sebastian with a smile that could have frozen champagne in its glass. "There, Your Grace," she announced in a voice that carried clearly across the silent assembly. "I have given you the kiss you so boldly requested, delivered through the most honorable proxy I could find in your own dear brother. Now, as a gentleman of your word, I trust you will proceed immediately with arrangements for our wedding, for I should hate to think that the Duke of Ravensholm would prove himself a liar before the cream of London society." The morning sun streaming through the windows of Ashworth House brought no relief from the storm that had erupted the previous evening, as news of Lady Beatrice's scandalous behaviour spread through London's drawing rooms faster than a fire through dry kindling. Beatrice sat in her father's study, her hands folded primly in her lap, while the Earl of Ashworth paced behind his mahogany desk like a caged lion, his face alternating between shades of purple and crimson as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his daughter's public disgrace. Lady Margaret had taken to her bed with smelling salts and a cold compress, declaring herself too overcome by mortification to face the world, while a steady stream of calling cards and hastily scribbled notes arrived at their door from society matrons eager to glean every delicious detail of the previous night's entertainment. "Beatrice, explain yourself this instant," the Earl demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fury as he brandished the morning papers, which had somehow managed to include breathless accounts of her kiss despite the late hour at which their scandal had unfolded. "Have you completely taken leave of your senses? Do you comprehend what you have done to this family's reputation? The headlines speak of nothing but your brazen display, and I have received no fewer than 6 urgent missives from concerned friends warning me that London society is buzzing with speculations about your future prospects and our family's honour." Beatrice lifted her chin with the same stubborn pride that had driven her to such desperate measures the night before, though in the harsh light of morning her actions seemed far less brilliant than they had in the heat of the moment. "I was defending myself against an insufferable insult, Papa," she replied with more confidence than she felt, her voice steady, despite the chaos swirling around her. "The Duke of Ravensholm treated me as nothing more than a plaything for his amusement and I refused to allow such behavior to pass unchallenged. Her father's expression grew even darker as he absorbed this explanation, his hands gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles showed white against his skin. "You kissed a man in public, Beatrice. A man you had never been properly introduced to in front of the entire ton. Whatever provocation you believe you suffered, nothing justifies such wanton behavior. Your reputation may well be beyond salvaging, and with it any hope of a respectable marriage." The gravity of her situation began to settle over Beatrice like a suffocating blanket as she considered the implications of her impulsive act. In her desire to humiliate Sebastian Blackwood, she had indeed compromised herself beyond what society would consider acceptable, and the realization that her moment of defiant satisfaction might have cost her any chance at a decent future filled her with a cold dread that no amount of righteous indignation could dispel. Before she could formulate a response that might somehow mitigate the damage, the butler appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed excitement that suggested the morning's drama was far from concluded. "My lord," he announced with formal precision that did nothing to hide his obvious fascination with the unfolding scandal, "the Duke of Ravensholm and Lord Gabriel Blackwood request an immediate audience with you and Lady Beatrice on a matter of utmost urgency." The Earl's face underwent another dramatic transformation as he absorbed this news, his anger giving way to a mixture of hope and apprehension that suggested he understood the potential significance of such an early morning call from two of London's most eligible bachelors. "Show them in immediately," he commanded, then turned to Beatrice with a stern expression that brooked no argument. "You will conduct yourself with perfect propriety during this interview, daughter. Whatever these gentlemen have come to propose, you will receive their words with appropriate gratitude and humility." The brothers entered the study with markedly different bearing. Sebastian's usual confident swagger somewhat subdued, but his presence still commanding attention as he moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to being the center of any room he entered, while Gabriel followed with the measured stride of a military officer. His expression serious but kind as he offered Beatrice a small bow of acknowledgement. Sebastian wore his finest morning coat, every detail of his appearance calculated to remind all present of his superior rank and social position, while Gabriel's attire was impeccable but understated, suggesting a man more concerned with substance than show. The Duke cleared his throat and addressed the Earl directly, his manner formal, but lacking his usual sardonic humour. "Lord Ashworth, I come before you this morning to address the events of last evening and to offer what I hope will be considered an acceptable solution to the unfortunate situation in which we all find ourselves. I take full responsibility for provoking Lady Beatrice to her regrettable action through my own thoughtless behaviour, and I am prepared to make whatever amends honour requires." The Earl leaned forward with obvious interest, clearly hoping that salvation for his daughter's reputation was about to be offered by the most powerful duke in England. Sebastian continued with careful precision, his gaze flicking briefly to Beatrice before returning to her father. "I therefore formally request permission to pay court to Lady Beatrice, with the intention of offering for her hand in marriage, should she prove amenable to such an arrangement. My rank and fortune are sufficient to overcome any temporary scandal, and I believe such a union would be beneficial to both our families." The silence that followed this pronouncement was broken by Gabriel's unexpected intervention, his voice calm but determined as he stepped forward to stand beside his brother. "Your Grace, Lord Ashworth, I must respectfully disagree with my brother's assessment of the situation. While I appreciate his desire to act honourably, I cannot allow him to sacrifice himself out of mere duty when my own feelings in this matter have become decidedly engaged." Gabriel turned to face Beatrice directly, his green eyes warm with an emotion she had not expected to see there, his words careful but sincere. "Lady Beatrice, Though our acquaintance is brief, I find myself profoundly affected by your courage and spirit as demonstrated last evening. If you would permit me, I should like to request the honor of calling upon you with the intention of securing your affections through proper courtship, that we might explore whether a deeper attachment might develop between us." The Earl stared at the two brothers in obvious bewilderment, clearly struggling to comprehend how his daughter's scandalous behavior had somehow resulted in marriage proposals from two of the most sought-after gentlemen in London society, while Beatrice felt her head spinning as she attempted to process the extraordinary turn her life had taken in the space of 12 hours. Sebastian's expression had darkened considerably at his brother's unexpected declaration, his jaw clenching with what appeared to be genuine anger rather than mere wounded pride. "Gabriel," he said with deceptive calm, "I believe you mistake the nature of this situation. Lady Beatrice's reputation requires immediate protection, which my offer of marriage would provide. Your romantic sensibilities, however admirable, are hardly relevant to the practical matters at hand." Gabriel's military bearing became more pronounced as he faced his brother with quiet determination, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious tension crackling between them. "On the contrary, Sebastian, I believe my feelings are entirely relevant. Lady Beatrice deserves more than a marriage of convenience designed to salvage her reputation from damage caused by your thoughtless wager. She deserves genuine affection and respect, which I am prepared to offer her." The brothers faced each other with a hostility that surprised everyone present, their usual comfortable relationship clearly strained by this unexpected conflict of interests, while Beatrice watched in growing amazement as two gentlemen who had barely known of her existence 24 hours earlier now appeared ready to come to blows over the privilege of courting her. The Earl, sensing an opportunity to secure an advantageous match for his difficult daughter, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Gentlemen, while I am grateful for your interest in Beatrice, perhaps the lady herself should be consulted regarding her preferences in this matter. Both of you are welcome to call upon her, and she may decide for herself which suit, if any, she chooses to encourage." Beatrice found herself the focus of 4 sets of eyes, each watching her with different expectations and hopes, while she struggled to find words adequate to address the surreal situation in which she found herself. "Your Grace, my lord," she began carefully, addressing both brothers with equal formality. "I am sensible of the honor you do me with your attention, and I appreciate your desire to act in my best interests. However, I should prefer to take some time to consider the implications of last evening's events before making any decisions that will affect the rest of my life." Both gentlemen accepted her request with varying degrees of grace, Sebastian's displeasure at the delay evident in his tight smile, while Gabriel merely nodded with understanding patience, and after formal arrangements were made for future calls, the brothers departed with a coolness between them that had not existed when they arrived. Later that afternoon, Beatrice received a visit from her dearest friend, Miss Cordelia Fairfax, whose dark eyes sparkled with curiosity and concern as she settled into the morning room for what promised to be an extremely illuminating conversation. "Beatrice, you must tell me everything," Cordelia demanded without preamble, her usual social niceties abandoned in favor of satisfying her burning desire to understand the extraordinary events that had set all of London talking. "The entire city is buzzing with the most incredible stories, each more outrageous than the last, and I simply must hear the truth from your own lips." Beatrice recounted the previous evening's events and the morning's surprising developments, while Cordelia listened with expressions of shock, admiration, and growing concern crossing her delicate features. When the tale was complete, her friend sat back in her chair with a thoughtful frown that suggested she was not entirely pleased with what she had heard. "Beatrice, while I admire your courage in standing up to the Duke's insufferable arrogance, I fear you have placed yourself in an extremely precarious position," Cordelia said with the frankness that characterized their friendship. "Both brothers are dangerous in their own ways. Sebastian, because he is a notorious rake who has never shown the slightest interest in matrimony, and Gabriel, because he appears genuinely smitten with you after a single encounter, which suggests a romantic nature that might prove overwhelming." Beatrice had been expecting congratulations on her triumph over Sebastian's presumption, and her friend's cautious response disappointed her considerably. "Surely you cannot fault Gabriel for his honorable behavior, Cordelia," she protested, remembering the warmth in his green eyes when he had spoken of his feelings for her. "His military service speaks to his character, and his willingness to court me properly shows respect for both myself and social conventions." Cordelia leaned forward with an earnest expression that conveyed the depth of her concern for her friend's welfare. "I do not fault him for his honor, dear, but I question the wisdom of accepting either brother when their family is clearly divided against itself. You have witnessed the beginning of what promises to be a significant rift between them, and any woman who comes between brothers, however innocently, often finds herself blamed for the destruction of their relationship. Consider carefully whether you wish to begin a marriage under such circumstances, for the happiness you might find with one brother could be forever shadowed by the resentment of the other." Sebastian Blackwood possessed an intuitive understanding of feminine psychology that had served him well throughout his illustrious career as London's most notorious rake, and he approached his campaign for Beatrice's affections with the strategic precision of a general planning a military offensive. The morning after his confrontation with Gabriel in the Earl's study, he dispatched his most trusted footman with the first salvo in what promised to be an elaborate siege of Lady Beatrice's defences. An exquisite bouquet of white roses, accompanied by a volume of Lord Byron's latest poetry, bound in Morocco leather with her initials embossed in gold. The accompanying note, written in his elegant script on heavy cream paper, bearing the Ravensholm crest, struck precisely the right tone of respectful admiration tempered with intriguing mystery. "My dear Lady Beatrice," it read, "I hope you will find these poor tokens adequate expression of my sincere desire to begin our acquaintance anew, freed from the unfortunate circumstances of our first meeting. I remain your most devoted servant, Ravensholm." The calculated simplicity of the message belied the complexity of thought behind it, for Sebastian understood that overwhelming Beatrice with excessive declarations would likely trigger her well-documented resistance to conventional courtship tactics. Over the following weeks, he orchestrated a campaign of subtle but unmistakable pursuit that demonstrated both his social power and his genuine interest in securing her regard, beginning with an invitation to accompany him to Lady Pemberton's exclusive musical evening, an event so coveted that even seasoned society matrons schemed for months to obtain tickets. When Beatrice appeared in the Ashworth drawing-room, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented her colouring magnificently, Sebastian felt an unexpected tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with calculated seduction and everything to do with genuine appreciation for her beauty. "Your taste is impeccable as always, Lady Beatrice," he murmured as he offered his arm, "though I confess the gown pales beside the radiance of its wearer." She accepted the compliment with a gracious incline of her head, though he detected a wariness in her hazel eyes that suggested she remained skeptical of his motivations, a challenge that only intensified his determination to prove himself worthy of her trust. At Lady Pemberton's salon, Sebastian deployed his considerable social influence with ruthless efficiency, introducing Beatrice to the cream of London society as though presenting a precious jewel worthy of universal admiration. The Countess of Westbrook, whose approval could make or break a young woman's social standing, found herself charmed by Beatrice's intelligent conversation about current political events, while the influential Mrs. Drummond Burrell declared her wit refreshing after enduring an evening of simpering misses who could speak of nothing beyond the weather and their new bonnets. Sebastian watched with satisfaction as Beatrice blossomed under this attention, her natural intelligence and quick humor winning over even the most critical observers, though he noticed she remained somewhat reserved in his own presence, as though maintaining careful guard against his legendary powers of persuasion term. The evening's entertainment featured a renowned Italian soprano whose performance of selections from Mozart's operas should have commanded Beatrice's full attention, yet Sebastian observed her stealing glances in his direction throughout the musical program, her expression thoughtful rather than swooning, which he found infinitely more intriguing than the usual rapturous gazes he inspired in susceptible young ladies. During the intermission, he guided her onto Lady Pemberton's famous terrace, where Chinese lanterns cast romantic shadows among the carefully cultivated roses and jasmine, the scent of the flowers heavy in the warm spring air. "This is quite beautiful," Beatrice commented as she admired the garden's elegant design, her voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation that reminded Sebastian why he found her so different from other women of his acquaintance. Most of his previous conquests would have used such a setting to hint broadly about romantic inclinations or to position themselves advantageously for stolen kisses, but Beatrice seemed genuinely interested in the aesthetic merits of their surroundings rather than the romantic possibilities they presented. Sebastian found himself studying her profile in the moonlight, noting the delicate curve of her jaw and the way the lantern light caught the auburn highlights in her carefully arranged hair, while his usual repertoire of practiced seductive conversation seemed suddenly inadequate to the task of engaging this remarkable woman. "Lady Beatrice," he began, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic note of uncertainty that would have shocked his friends, "I hope you will not think me presumptuous if I confess that these past weeks in your company have proven quite revelatory. I find myself questioning assumptions I have held for years about what truly constitutes worthy companionship." She turned to face him directly, her intelligent eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel unexpectedly vulnerable, as though she could see past his carefully constructed facade to the man beneath. "Your Grace," she replied carefully, "I appreciate your kindness in introducing me to your distinguished friends, and I have indeed enjoyed our conversations more than I anticipated when this arrangement began. However, I must be honest with you about my concerns regarding your motivations and my own confused feelings about this entire situation." The honesty in her voice struck him with unexpected force, reminding him that Beatrice possessed the rare quality of speaking truth, even when diplomacy might serve her better, and for the first time in his adult life, Sebastian found himself genuinely uncertain about how to proceed with a woman who refused to be dazzled by his usual arsenal of charm and sophistication. He stepped closer, drawn by an impulse he did not entirely understand, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that surprised them both. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he had not intended to reveal, "you must know that what began as a foolish wager has become something far more significant. You are unlike any woman I have ever encountered, and I find myself thinking of you at the most inappropriate moments, wondering what thoughts occupy that magnificent mind of yours." She stood perfectly still as he leaned closer, her breathing shallow, as his intention became unmistakably clear, but just as his lips would have touched hers, she stepped back with a sudden movement that left him staring at empty air. "You do not understand, Your Grace," she said with a firmness that brooked no argument. "This is not a game to me. My reputation, my future, my very happiness hang in the balance of decisions I make now, and I cannot afford to be swept away by romantic gestures that may mean nothing more to you than temporary amusement." The rejection stung more than Sebastian had expected, but her words penetrated his consciousness with startling clarity, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable possibility that his feelings for Beatrice Ashworth had evolved far beyond the casual interest he had originally intended to pursue. For the first time in his dissolute career, he found himself genuinely caring about a woman's opinion of his character, wanting her to see him as more than the heartless rake society believed him to be, and the realization that he might actually be falling in love with the woman he had initially pursued as a mere conquest shook him to his very foundations. Gabriel Blackwood approached courtship with the same methodical patience he had applied to military strategy, though his campaign for Beatrice's affections differed dramatically from his brother's elaborate social maneuvering in both style and substance. Where Sebastian sought to dazzle her with glimpses of the glamorous life she could enjoy as a duchess, Gabriel focused on discovering the woman beneath the witty exterior, treating her as an intellectual equal worthy of serious conversation rather than merely an object to be won through superior tactics. His first formal call at Ashworth House established the tone for what would become a series of increasingly meaningful encounters, as he arrived bearing not exotic flowers or expensive gifts, but rather a worn copy of Mary Wollstonecraft's controversial writings that he had discovered she mentioned during their brief conversation at Lady Pemberton's salon. "I thought you might enjoy reading something that challenges conventional thinking about women's education," he explained, with a slight smile that transformed his serious countenance into something altogether more appealing. "I confess I found her arguments quite compelling, though I suspect you may have insights that escaped my masculine understanding." Beatrice accepted the book with obvious pleasure, her eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm as she examined the well-thumbed pages that showed evidence of careful study rather than cursory reading. "Most gentlemen would consider such material inappropriate for feminine consumption, my lord," she observed, with the directness he was learning to appreciate. "Do you not fear that encouraging ladies to think independently might prove dangerous to the established order?" Gabriel settled into the chair Lady Margaret had indicated with the relaxed confidence of a man comfortable in his own convictions, his military bearing evident in the straight line of his shoulders despite the informal nature of their meeting. "On the contrary, Lady Beatrice, I believe society benefits when all its members are encouraged to develop their intellectual capacities to the fullest extent possible. My experiences during the Peninsular campaigns taught me that intelligence and courage are not confined to any single class or gender, and I have observed that the most successful communities are those that value the contributions of all their citizens." The conversation that followed revealed depths to Gabriel's character that Beatrice had not suspected, as he spoke thoughtfully about his observations of different cultures during his military service, his plans for modernizing the agricultural practices on his inherited estates, and his belief that England's future prosperity depended upon embracing progressive ideas rather than clinging to outdated traditions simply because they were familiar. Unlike Sebastian's calculated charm, Gabriel's appeal lay in his obvious sincerity and his willingness to listen to her opinions without condescension or the subtle mockery she had learned to expect from most gentlemen of her acquaintance. Their afternoon walks became regular occurrences, carefully chaperoned by Lady Margaret, but conducted with enough privacy to allow for genuine conversation about topics ranging from literature and politics to philosophy and social reform. Gabriel proved surprisingly well read for a military man, his library having provided solace during long winter campaigns when action was impossible and reflection became necessity. He told her stories of his service with humor rather than braggadocio, focusing on the courage and resilience of common soldiers rather than his own heroic actions, though she gradually pieced together evidence of his distinguished record from casual references to battles and commendations. "I never intended to make the army my career," he confided during one particularly pleasant walk through Hyde Park, when the spring sunshine had brought out families and couples enjoying the mild weather. "I purchased my commission primarily to escape Sebastian's shadow and prove myself capable of independent achievement. Living as the younger son of a duke has its advantages. Certainly, but it also creates expectations and comparisons that can become quite suffocating. Beatrice found herself drawn to his honesty about the difficulties of his position, understanding for the first time the complexity of relationships within aristocratic families, where titles and inheritance created artificial hierarchies even between loving siblings. "You succeeded admirably," she replied warmly, having heard enough about his military service to recognize that his modest descriptions concealed genuine heroism and leadership. "I suspect your soldiers respected you precisely because you saw them as individuals rather than mere instruments of war." Their conversation was interrupted by the thunder of hooves as a runaway horse charged directly toward a group of children playing near the Serpentine. But before Gabriel could react, Beatrice had spurred her own mount forward in an attempt to intercept the animal before it could cause injury. Her intervention succeeded in diverting the horse's attention, but the sudden maneuver caused her usually reliable mare to shy violently, throwing Beatrice from the saddle with enough force to leave her stunned and shaken on the ground. Gabriel reached her side within seconds, his face pale with concern as he knelt beside her, his hands gentle but thorough as he checked for serious injuries while maintaining perfect propriety despite his obvious worry. "Can you move your fingers? Your toes? Does anything feel broken?" he asked urgently, his medical knowledge gained from battlefield experience evident in the systematic nature of his examination. When he was satisfied that she had suffered nothing worse than bruises and wounded dignity, he helped her to a nearby bench, his arm around her waist, providing steady support, while his free hand smoothed an escaped curl from her forehead with infinite tenderness. "You frightened me terribly," he admitted quietly, his voice rough with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "I have seen enough senseless accidents to know how quickly tragedy can strike, and the thought of losing you before I had the opportunity to properly court you filled me with absolute dread." The sincerity in his voice and the genuine fear she glimpsed in his green eyes touched Beatrice more deeply than any of Sebastian's polished compliments, for she recognized that Gabriel's concern sprang from authentic caring rather than mere gallantry. And as she rested against his strong shoulder while her racing heart gradually slowed, she began to understand that safety and genuine affection might prove more valuable than excitement and social position in creating lasting happiness. The revelation of Sebastian's original wager came to Beatrice through the poisonous whispers of Miss Penelope Whitmore, a blonde beauty whose ambitions for securing the Duke of Ravensholm's affections had been thoroughly thwarted by Beatrice's unexpected appearance in his life. Penelope had spent 3 seasons positioning herself as the perfect Duchess material, her family's fortune and her own considerable charms seemingly adequate qualifications for capturing London's most elusive bachelor, until Beatrice's scandalous kiss had redirected Sebastian's attention in the most mortifying fashion imaginable. The opportunity for revenge presented itself during Lady Worthington's afternoon tea, where London's most influential ladies gathered weekly to exchange gossip and assess the romantic entanglements of the season's participants. Penelope waited until Beatrice was surrounded by a circle of admirers, all eager to hear more about her remarkable courtship by both Blackwood brothers, before delivering her carefully calculated blow with the precision of a master swordsman striking a fatal thrust. "My dear Lady Beatrice," Penelope began with false sweetness, her blue eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction as she prepared to destroy her rival's happiness, "I do hope you will not think me presumptuous for sharing some rather interesting information that has come to my attention regarding the circumstances of your first encounter with His Grace. I was present at Almack's that evening, of course, though perhaps positioned where I could observe events from a rather different perspective than your own." The assembled ladies leaned forward with obvious anticipation, sensing the approach of delicious scandal, while Beatrice felt a cold premonition settling in her stomach as she recognized the particular tone that preceded devastating social revelations. Penelope continued with obvious relish, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent drawing room. I could not help but overhear the conversation preceding the Duke's dramatic declaration. You understand, as I was standing quite close to his circle of friends when they proposed their amusing little wager. Such a clever jest, really, to see whether the notorious Duke of Ravensholm could indeed make any wallflower fall desperately in love with him within a single month. The cruel laughter that followed his selection of you as the perfect test subject was quite entertaining, I must say, though I confess I found his comments about your marriage prospects rather harsh. He suggested, if memory serves, that you had grown so particular in your requirements that no gentleman would ever prove acceptable, making you the ideal challenge for demonstrating his legendary powers of seduction. The words hit Beatrice with the force of physical blows, each revelation stripping away another layer of the dignity and hope she had allowed herself to build around Sebastian's courtship, until she felt as exposed and vulnerable as if she were standing naked before the assembled company. The sympathetic murmurs and shocked gasps of the other ladies only intensified her humiliation, for she realized that her romantic drama had become nothing more than entertainment for people who had never wished her well, and that Sebastian's apparently genuine interest in her character and opinions had been merely the calculated performance of a master manipulator pursuing victory in a cruel game. Beatrice excused herself from Lady Worthington's gathering with what dignity she could muster, though she suspected her pale complexion and trembling hands had revealed the extent of her distress to the avid observers, who would undoubtedly dissect every detail of her reaction before the afternoon was concluded. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of anguish as she replayed every interaction with Sebastian, searching for signs of deception she had been too naive to recognize, remembering how his friends had watched their developing courtship with amusement rather than the respectful interest she had attributed to their attention. By the time she reached Ashworth House, her initial shock had crystallized into a burning fury that demanded immediate satisfaction, and she dispatched a terse note to Ravensholm House requesting Sebastian's presence at his earliest convenience for a matter of urgent importance. He arrived within the hour, his usual confident demeanor somewhat subdued, as though he sensed the changed atmosphere, his greeting formal rather than warm as he followed her into the morning room where she had chosen to stage their confrontation. Sebastian settled into the chair she indicated with visible wariness, his blue eyes searching her face for clues about the reason for her summons, though the rigid control in her posture and the dangerous glitter in her hazel eyes should have warned him that his carefully constructed courtship was about to crumble into ruins. "Lady Beatrice," he began with attempted lightness, though his voice carried an undertone of concern, "I hope I have not kept you waiting long. Your message suggested some urgency, and I confess myself curious about what matter requires such immediate attention." Beatrice fixed him with a stare that could have frozen fire, her voice deadly calm as she prepared to strip away the pretenses that had governed their relationship from its inception. "Your Grace, I have recently been informed of certain facts regarding our acquaintance that I find quite illuminating. I should very much like to hear your explanation of the wager you made with your friends at Almack's, the one that resulted in my selection as your victim for a month-long exercise in seduction. I am particularly interested in learning whether any portion of your subsequent courtship was motivated by genuine feeling rather than mere determination to win your foolish bet." The color drained from Sebastian's face as he absorbed the implications of her words, his usual eloquence deserting him as he realized the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his carefully laid plans. He had always known that discovery of the original wager was possible, but he had foolishly believed himself capable of managing such a revelation when and if it occurred, never imagining that the truth would be revealed by malicious gossip before he could confess it himself, and explain how dramatically his motivations had evolved. "Beatrice," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual arrogant confidence, "I cannot deny that our acquaintance began with the circumstances you describe. The wager was real, and my initial approach to you was indeed motivated by the desire to prove a point to my friends about the universality of feminine susceptibility to determined pursuit. However, you must believe me when I tell you that everything changed once I came to know you properly. Your intelligence, your spirit, your refusal to be impressed by superficial advantages, all conspired to make me see you as far more than a mere conquest to be won through superior strategy." Beatrice rose from her chair with fluid grace, her bearing regal despite the pain she could no longer entirely conceal, her voice cutting through his explanations with the precision of a rapier thrust. "Your Grace," she said with icy formality, "I am afraid your belated honesty comes rather too late to salvage either my dignity or my trust in your character. You speak of changed feelings as though they excuse the fundamental deception that underlies our entire acquaintance. But I find myself wondering whether your supposed transformation is merely another calculated move in your elaborate game. How am I to distinguish between genuine emotion and practiced performance when everything you have told me has been tainted by the knowledge that I was selected as your target for reasons that had nothing to do with any merit I possessed?" Sebastian rose as well, his hands clenched at his sides as he struggled to find words that might somehow bridge the chasm that had opened between them, his usual command of language failing him when he needed it most desperately. "You were meant to be a jest," he confessed, with the brutal honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. "But you have become everything to me. I know how that sounds, how impossible it must be for you to believe, but somewhere between our first conversation and last night's walk in the moonlight, I found myself falling in love with a woman I never expected to exist. Your wit challenges me, your principles humble me, your beauty haunts my dreams, and the thought of losing you now fills me with a despair I have never experienced before." The raw emotion in his voice might have moved her under different circumstances, but Beatrice found herself unable to separate his current protestations from the calculated charm he had deployed so effectively throughout their courtship, her heart too wounded by his deception to risk further injury, by believing in promises that might prove equally false. "I am afraid, Your Grace," she replied with finality that cut through his desperate explanations like a sword through silk, "that your revelation has made it impossible for me to continue our acquaintance with any degree of comfort or trust. I must ask you to cease your attentions and allow me to determine my future without the complication of wondering whether your interest in my welfare is genuine or merely the continuation of an elaborate masquerade designed to salve your wounded pride." The news of Sebastian's original wager reached Gabriel through his brother's own tormented confession, delivered in the library at Blackwood Manor, where both men had retreated after an increasingly tense family dinner, during which Sebastian's distraction and Gabriel's obvious concern had created an atmosphere of unspoken conflict that even their grandmother had found difficult to ignore. Gabriel listened in growing horror as Sebastian recounted the events at Almack's, his military training in strategic analysis allowing him to immediately grasp the implications of what he was hearing, though his fundamental sense of honor recoiled from the casual cruelty his brother described with obvious self-loathing. The full magnitude of Sebastian's betrayal struck him with devastating force, as he realized that Beatrice had been manipulated and humiliated by the very man who now claimed to love her, and that his own developing feelings for her had been complicated by circumstances far more sordid than he had imagined. "You treated her like a plaything," Gabriel said, with quiet fury that was far more menacing than any shouted accusation could have been, his green eyes blazing with an anger that transformed his usually gentle features into something altogether more dangerous. You selected her for your amusement based on the cruelest possible criteria, subjected her to public scrutiny and private manipulation, all for the sake of proving your superiority in a game she did not even know she was playing. The fact that you claim to have developed genuine feelings for her does not excuse the fundamental violation of trust and dignity that characterized your original approach. Sebastian, who had expected anger but hoped for understanding from the brother whose opinion he valued above all others, found himself facing a judgment more harsh than any he had anticipated, his usual defenses crumbling under the weight of Gabriel's moral certainty. "I know how it appears," he began desperately. "But surely you can understand that a man may begin one course of action for unworthy reasons and find himself pursuing it for entirely different motives as circumstances evolve. I love her, Gabriel, with a depth and sincerity that surprises me as much as it would surprise her, and I am prepared to spend the rest of my life proving the genuineness of my transformation if she will only give me the opportunity to do so." Gabriel's expression grew even more stern as he absorbed his brother's plea, his sense of justice warring with his natural affection for Sebastian, though ultimately his concern for Beatrice's welfare took precedence over family loyalty. "Whether your feelings are genuine or not is immaterial at this point," he replied with the decisive authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "You have forfeited any right to her consideration through your own actions, and I will not stand by and watch you compound the injury you have already inflicted by pursuing her further when she has made her feelings about your deception perfectly clear." Gabriel's next words carried the weight of absolute determination that brooked no argument or negotiation. "I intend to offer for Lady Beatrice myself, with complete honesty about my feelings and my intentions, and I will not allow your prior claim based on fraud and manipulation to interfere with her right to choose a husband who will value her properly from the beginning of their acquaintance." That very evening, Gabriel presented himself at Ashworth House with the formal bearing of a man embarking upon the most important mission of his life. His request for a private interview with Lady Beatrice, granted immediately by an earl who had observed the growing tension between the Blackwood brothers with considerable concern for his daughter's welfare. Beatrice received him in the same morning room where she had confronted Sebastian hours earlier, though Gabriel's presence brought none of the charged atmosphere that had characterized her encounter with his brother, instead filling the space with a calm certainty that seemed to promise refuge from the emotional turmoil that had dominated her recent weeks. "Lady Beatrice," he began without preamble, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. "I come before you this evening not as Sebastian's brother or as a participant in the complex drama that has surrounded your acquaintance with my family, but simply as a man who has found himself deeply and genuinely in love with a woman whose character and intelligence have captured his admiration completely. I am aware of the circumstances that originally brought you to Sebastian's attention, and I am prepared to offer you something he cannot, namely, the absolute certainty that my interest in you has been honest and straightforward from our first meeting." Gabriel moved closer, his expression earnest as he continued with the careful precision of a man who understood that words spoken in this moment would determine the course of both their lives. "I ask for your hand in marriage, Lady Beatrice, not to save you from scandal or to compete with my brother for a prize, but because I believe we could find genuine happiness together based on mutual respect, shared values, and the deep affection I have already developed for you during our brief but meaningful acquaintance. I offer you my name, my protection, my complete devotion, and most importantly, my promise that you will never have cause to doubt the sincerity of my feelings or the honesty of my intentions toward you." The proposal, delivered with such straightforward sincerity after the emotional manipulation she had endured, moved Beatrice to tears that were partly relief and partly gratitude for finding herself valued by a man whose integrity she had never had reason to question. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she placed her hand in his. "I will marry you, Gabriel, and I thank you for offering me the security of knowing that our union will be built upon truth rather than deception." The engagement announcement that appeared in the morning papers 2 days later sent shockwaves through London society and left Sebastian staring at the printed words with the growing realization that his careless pursuit of entertainment had cost him the only woman he had ever truly loved, while Gabriel and Beatrice began planning a future together that promised to heal the wounds inflicted by pride, deception, and the casual cruelty of those who treat human hearts as objects in a game. The announcement of Lady Beatrice Ashworth's engagement to Lord Gabriel Blackwood appeared in the Morning Post on a crisp Thursday morning in late April, and by noon the news had spread through every fashionable drawing-room in Mayfair with the speed and thoroughness that only the most scandalous gossip could achieve. The unprecedented nature of the situation, involving as it did the younger brother of a duke, securing the hand of a woman who had been so publicly courted by his elder sibling, provided fodder for speculation that would sustain London society's appetite for drama well into the summer season. At Lady Pemberton's weekly salon, the assembled ladies dissected every nuance of the extraordinary turn of events with the analytical precision of natural philosophers examining a particularly fascinating specimen, their opinions divided between admiration for Gabriel's romantic gesture and disapproval of Beatrice's apparent rejection of superior social position in favor of wounded pride. The Countess of Westbrook, whose judgment carried considerable weight among the upper echelons of society, declared herself thoroughly impressed by Lord Gabriel's honourable conduct throughout the affair, noting that his military service had obviously instilled in him the sort of principled character that made him an ideal husband for any sensible young woman seeking stability over mere glamour. Her assessment was echoed by several other matrons who had observed Gabriel's courtship with approval, appreciating his respectful attention to propriety and his obvious sincere regard for Beatrice's intellectual capabilities rather than merely her physical charms. However, a significant faction of society observers, led by the sharp-tongued Duchess of Marlborough, expressed the opinion that Beatrice had made a grave error in rejecting the opportunity to become a duchess in favor of accepting the secondary title and more modest circumstances that marriage to a younger son would provide. These critics whispered that wounded pride and feminine spite had clouded her judgment, preventing her from recognizing that Sebastian's initial deception did not necessarily negate the genuine feelings he claimed to have developed during their acquaintance. The speculation grew even more intense when it became known that Sebastian had not appeared in public since the engagement announcement, leading to rumors that the Duke of Ravensholm was either planning some dramatic gesture to reclaim his lost love or had fallen into a state of melancholic brooding that would require considerable time and distance to resolve. The more romantically inclined observers hoped for the former possibility, envisioning tearful reconciliations and passionate declarations that would provide the ton with entertainment worthy of the most popular novels, while the more pragmatic commentators suspected that Sebastian's absence from social gatherings indicated a wounded pride that would eventually heal but would never again expose him to the vulnerability he had experienced through his pursuit of Beatrice. Lady Margaret Ashworth received the news of her daughter's engagement with feelings that defied easy categorization, her maternal satisfaction at seeing Beatrice settled with a respectable gentleman warring with disappointment at the missed opportunity for her daughter to achieve the pinnacle of social success that marriage to a duke would have represented. She had spent considerable effort cultivating connections that might prove beneficial to a future Duchess of Ravensholm, and the prospect of redirecting those energies toward supporting a future Viscountess required a significant adjustment of expectations and aspirations. Nevertheless, her genuine affection for Gabriel, whom she had always considered superior to his elder brother in matters of character and reliability, made it impossible to view the match as anything other than advantageous for Beatrice's long-term happiness, even if it fell short of the social triumph she had originally envisioned. During the formal interview in which Gabriel requested permission to pay his addresses to her daughter, Lady Margaret found herself impressed by his straightforward sincerity and his obvious understanding of the responsibilities that would accompany marriage to a woman of Beatrice's intelligence and strong opinions. "I confess, Lord Gabriel," she told him with the candor that had always characterized her conversations with young people, "that I had hoped to see Beatrice established in a position that would reflect her considerable merits and provide her with the social influence she deserves. However, I have observed your character long enough to recognize that you possess the qualities most essential for her happiness, namely integrity, compassion, and the wisdom to appreciate her unique qualities rather than attempting to suppress them in favor of conventional feminine submissiveness." Gabriel's response revealed both his understanding of her concerns and his determination to prove worthy of her trust in his ability to make Beatrice happy, despite the dramatic circumstances that had brought about their engagement. "My lady," he replied with the respectful formality that had always marked his dealings with her, "I am fully aware that I cannot offer your daughter the elevated position that marriage to my brother would have provided, but I can promise you that she will never have cause to doubt either my devotion to her welfare or my commitment to supporting her intellectual and social interests to the fullest extent of my abilities. I believe that genuine love and mutual respect provide a more solid foundation for lasting happiness than social prominence based on deception and manipulation. And I am prepared to spend my lifetime proving the truth of that conviction through my conduct as Beatrice's husband." The weeks following the engagement announcement proved challenging for Beatrice as she struggled to reconcile her decision with the complex emotions that continued to plague her whenever she encountered reminders of Sebastian's passionate pursuit and her own inexplicable response to his magnetic personality. Her rational mind repeatedly confirmed the wisdom of accepting Gabriel's proposal, cataloguing his virtues with the thoroughness of a scholar preparing a dissertation on masculine excellence. Yet some treacherous corner of her heart continued to whisper that security and respectability might prove poor substitutes for the intoxicating excitement that Sebastian had brought to her previously ordered existence. The comparison between the two brothers became an obsession she could not shake, manifesting itself in moments when Gabriel's patient kindness struck her as almost too perfect, lacking the unpredictable intensity that had made every encounter with Sebastian feel like a dangerous adventure into uncharted emotional territory. She found herself analyzing Gabriel's every gesture and comment for signs of the passionate depth she had glimpsed beneath Sebastian's polished exterior, wondering whether her future husband's steady character concealed hidden fires or whether his gentle nature represented the full extent of his emotional capacity. The guilt that accompanied these disloyal thoughts only intensified her confusion, for she recognized the unfairness of expecting Gabriel to compete with memories of a relationship that had been built upon deception and manipulation, yet she could not entirely silence the voice that questioned whether she was settling for comfortable affection when her heart yearned for something more transformative and overwhelming. Gabriel, with the intuitive understanding that military service had taught him to apply to human nature as well as tactical situations, sensed her internal conflict without requiring explicit confession of her doubts, and he responded to her uncertainty with a patience and determination that demonstrated his commitment to winning her heart completely rather than merely securing her compliance with their engagement. He courted his own fiancée with the same careful attention he had shown during their initial acquaintance, planning excursions that would allow them to discover shared interests and values, engaging her in conversations that revealed the depth of his thinking on subjects ranging from estate management to social reform, and gradually building the foundation of intimacy upon which a successful marriage could be constructed. Gabriel's approach to their engagement reflected his understanding that Beatrice needed time to develop the sort of deep emotional attachment that would sustain her through the challenges and compromises that married life would inevitably present, and he set about the task of earning her love with the systematic thoroughness that had made him an effective military leader. His tales of peninsular campaigns were never boastful recitations of his own heroism, but rather thoughtful analyses of the courage and resourcefulness he had witnessed among common soldiers, his admiration for the men under his command evident in every story he shared with her. During one particularly memorable afternoon walk through the gardens at Blackwood Manor, he described his encounter with a young Portuguese farmer whose family had been displaced by the war, explaining how the man's determination to rebuild his destroyed home had inspired Gabriel's own plans for improving conditions among the tenant farmers on his inherited estates. "I learned more about true nobility from that farmer than I ever did from observing the supposed gentlemen of my own class," he told Beatrice, with conviction that revealed the sincerity of his progressive beliefs. He possessed nothing but his willingness to work and his faith in a better future, yet he showed more genuine aristocratic spirit than most of the titled fools I have known, who believe birth grants them superiority over their fellow men. Beatrice found herself increasingly drawn to Gabriel's vision of a marriage that would allow both partners to work together toward meaningful goals, his descriptions of estate improvements and social reforms painting a picture of a future that would provide purpose beyond mere personal happiness. His plans for establishing a school for tenant children, improving housing conditions for estate workers, and introducing modern agricultural techniques that would benefit everyone involved in the enterprise appealed to her own desire to make a positive contribution to society rather than simply enjoying the privileges of aristocratic leisure. Yet even as she appreciated Gabriel's admirable qualities and found herself growing genuinely fond of his company, Beatrice could not entirely escape the memory of Sebastian's more dramatic presence, or the way her pulse had quickened whenever he entered a room, and she began to fear that she was doing Gabriel a disservice by accepting his proposal when her heart remained partially engaged elsewhere. The test of her conflicted feelings came unexpectedly during the Worthington Ball, where Sebastian made his first public appearance since the engagement announcement. His presence immediately noticeable, despite his obvious attempt to remain inconspicuous among the gathered guests. Beatrice felt his arrival like a physical shock, her body responding to his proximity with an intensity that made her grateful for Gabriel's steadying presence at her side, though she could not prevent herself from stealing glances in Sebastian's direction throughout the evening. When Gabriel was temporarily called away to settle a disagreement between two elderly gentlemen who had begun arguing about military strategy, Sebastian approached her with the careful movements of a man walking through a minefield, his usual confidence replaced by an uncertainty that made him appear almost vulnerable despite his imposing presence. "Lady Beatrice," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its customary arrogance, "I hope you will permit me to offer my congratulations on your engagement and my sincere wishes for your happiness. Gabriel is a fortunate man to have earned the regard of a woman whose character and intelligence make her worthy of far better treatment than she has received from some quarters." The carefully neutral words could not disguise the pain in his blue eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and Beatrice found herself fighting the irrational urge to comfort him, despite knowing that his suffering was largely the consequence of his own actions. "Your Grace," she replied with formal politeness that concealed the turmoil his presence had unleashed, "I thank you for your kind wishes and trust that you will find the happiness that has thus far eluded you." The brief exchange lasted no more than a few minutes, but the electric tension that crackled between them was unmistakable to anyone with eyes to see, leaving Beatrice more confused than ever about her true feelings and forcing her to confront the uncomfortable possibility that her engagement to Gabriel might represent an attempt to escape from emotions she was not prepared to acknowledge, rather than a genuine commitment to building a future with the man she claimed to love. As Sebastian withdrew with a bow that managed to convey both respect and regret, Beatrice realized that her heart remained far from settled despite her rational decision to accept Gabriel's proposal. And she began to wonder whether she possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to honor her commitment to a man whose only fault lay in being compared to a brother whose hold over her emotions defied both logic and moral principle. Sebastian's transformation began not with grand gestures designed to capture public attention, but with quiet acts of contrition that reflected a genuine understanding of the principles he had violated through his careless pursuit of entertainment at another's expense. The Duke of Ravensholm, who had never concerned himself with the welfare of those beneath his social station beyond the minimal obligations his position required, found himself riding out to inspect the conditions of his tenant farmers with an attention to detail that surprised both his estate manager and the farmers themselves. During one such visit, he discovered that the Hartwell family faced eviction due to debts incurred when their eldest son had been injured in a farming accident that prevented him from contributing to the harvest, leaving the family unable to meet their rent obligations despite their previous reliability and hard work. The old Sebastian would have dismissed such concerns as the inevitable consequence of peasant improvidence, but the man who had learned humility through his failed courtship of Beatrice Ashworth found himself genuinely moved by the family's plight, and determined to demonstrate through action rather than words that his character had undergone fundamental alteration. He not only forgave the outstanding debt, but also arranged for the injured son to receive proper medical attention from a physician in London, establishing a fund to ensure that similar emergencies among his tenants would not result in destitution for families whose only crime was the misfortune that could befall anyone regardless of their moral worth or industriousness. Word of his unexpected generosity spread through the county with remarkable speed, creating the first stirrings of a reputation that had nothing to do with his notorious romantic exploits, and everything to do with the sort of responsible stewardship that characterized true aristocratic leadership rather than mere hereditary privilege. His next act of reform targeted an issue closer to Gabriel's heart, as Sebastian established a substantial charitable foundation dedicated to supporting veterans of the Peninsular campaigns who had returned from service wounded in body or spirit, unable to resume their previous occupations and often abandoned by a society that had celebrated their heroism in wartime but quickly forgotten their sacrifices once peace was restored. The foundation provided not merely financial assistance, but also practical training in trades that would allow disabled soldiers to support themselves with dignity, while also offering medical care for those whose injuries required ongoing treatment that their own resources could not provide. Sebastian's personal involvement in the project surprised those who knew him, as he spent hours interviewing veterans to understand their specific needs and challenges. His conversations with men who had served under Gabriel's command, providing him with insights into his brother's character that he had never bothered to seek during their youth together. Through these interactions, he began to comprehend the depth of respect and affection Gabriel commanded among those who had served with him, understanding for the first time that his younger brother possessed qualities of leadership and compassion that had nothing to do with inherited position and everything to do with earned authority based on genuine care for others' welfare. The Foundation's work became Sebastian's primary occupation during the weeks following Beatrice's engagement, providing him with both purpose and a means of honoring the brother whose happiness he had inadvertently destroyed through his own selfish pursuits, though he carefully ensured that his charitable activities received no public recognition that might suggest he was performing acts of kindness merely to rehabilitate his damaged reputation. The culmination of Sebastian's transformation manifested itself in a letter to Beatrice that required multiple drafts before he achieved the tone of humble sincerity he sought, each revision stripping away another layer of the sophisticated rhetoric that had characterized his previous correspondence in favor of direct emotional honesty that felt both foreign and necessary to his purpose. The final version, written on plain paper rather than his usual expensive stationery bearing the ducal crest, represented the most vulnerable communication he had ever composed, exposing thoughts and feelings he had never shared with another human being, despite his reputation for effortless charm and easy intimacy. "My dearest Beatrice," he wrote in script that lacked his usual elegant flourishes, betraying the trembling hand that had guided the pen. "I write to you not in hope of changing your decision regarding your engagement, for I understand that my actions have forfeited any claim to your consideration, but rather to ensure that you possess complete knowledge of the transformation you have wrought in a man who believed himself incapable of genuine feeling or moral growth. You asked me once whether any portion of my attention was motivated by authentic emotion rather than calculated performance, and I find that question haunts my every waking moment, not because I doubt the answer, but because I fear you will never believe the truth of what you accomplished simply by being yourself in the presence of a man who had forgotten that authentic goodness could exist without artifice or ulterior motive." The letter continued for several pages, detailing not his charitable works, which he mentioned only in passing, but rather the profound alteration in his understanding of himself and his obligations to others that had resulted from witnessing Beatrice's unwavering principles and moral courage. "You showed me, through your own example, what it means to live according to conviction rather than convenience, to value truth over temporary advantage, and to extend compassion even to those who have not earned such generosity through their conduct. I know that my initial approach to you was unforgivable, motivated by pride and the desire to prove my superiority in matters where superiority itself represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what human relationships should provide to both parties involved. Yet I also know that somewhere between my first calculated compliment and our last conversation in Lady Pemberton's garden, I discovered feelings that surprised me with their intensity and their complete independence from any desire for conquest or social triumph. The letter found its way to Beatrice through his usual footman, though Sebastian had instructed that it be delivered only when she was alone and could read its contents without the immediate pressure of others' observations or expectations regarding her response. Beatrice received the communication in her morning room while Gabriel was occupied with estate business, and she read its contents with growing emotion that shifted from anger to surprise to a deep sadness that had little to do with her own situation and everything to do with recognition of the genuine anguish that suffused every carefully chosen word. The vulnerability Sebastian revealed touched her more profoundly than any of his previous attempts at courtship, for she could sense the effort it had required for a man of his pride to strip away all pretense and acknowledge not only his failures, but also his transformation in terms that made no attempt to excuse or minimize the harm he had caused. His description of the charitable foundation he had established moved her particularly, not because of its scale or significance, but because of his obvious understanding of why such work would matter to Gabriel. And she began to comprehend that Sebastian's reformation encompassed not merely his treatment of her, but his entire approach to the responsibilities that accompanied his elevated position in society. The letter concluded with words that would remain burned into her memory, regardless of the decisions she ultimately made regarding her future. I do not ask for forgiveness, for I understand that some injuries cannot be healed through mere regret, no matter how sincere. I ask only that you remember, in whatever happiness you find with Gabriel, that you succeeded in awakening something noble in a man who had convinced himself that cynicism represented wisdom, and that emotional detachment constituted strength. You made me want to become worthy of your regard, and though I failed in that endeavor through my own cowardice and selfishness, the desire itself represents a gift I will treasure regardless of whether you can ever find it possible to trust me again." Gabriel discovered the letter quite by accident when he returned from his business earlier than expected, and found Beatrice in the morning room, her face tear-stained as she clutched the folded pages with hands that trembled with emotion she made no attempt to conceal or explain. His military experience had taught him to assess situations quickly and accurately, and the sight of his fiancée in obvious distress over correspondence that bore his brother's distinctive handwriting told him everything he needed to know about the nature of the communication and its effect upon the woman he loved. Rather than demanding an explanation or reacting with the jealousy that might have been expected under such circumstances, Gabriel simply sat beside Beatrice and waited with the patient silence of a man who understood that some moments required space for truth to emerge naturally, rather than being forced through interrogation or accusation. When she finally looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of guilt, confusion, and something that might have been relief at being discovered, he simply asked whether she wished to discuss what she had read, or whether she preferred to process her thoughts in solitude before addressing the implications of whatever Sebastian had written. Beatrice handed him the letter without comment, understanding that their engagement had progressed to a point where complete honesty represented the only foundation upon which their future relationship could be built, regardless of whether that future remained the one they had originally planned together. Gabriel read Sebastian's words with the same careful attention he would have devoted to military dispatches containing crucial intelligence about enemy positions, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he absorbed both the content of his brother's confession and the obvious sincerity of the emotions that had motivated its composition. When he finished reading, he folded the letter carefully and returned it to Beatrice, his green eyes reflecting a sadness that had nothing to do with wounded pride, and everything to do with the recognition that the situation had become far more complex than any of them had originally anticipated. Gabriel rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the garden where he had spent so many pleasant hours in Beatrice's company, building the friendship that had seemed to promise a solid foundation for their marriage, his shoulders carrying the weight of a decision that would require him to set aside his own desires in service of something he valued even more highly than his personal happiness. "Beatrice," he said quietly without turning to face her, his voice carrying the steady control that had served him well during his military career. When difficult choices could not be avoided simply because they caused pain, I think we must acknowledge that this letter changes the fundamental nature of our situation and requires us to examine our engagement with complete honesty about our respective feelings and motivations. I have always prided myself on being a man who faces uncomfortable truths rather than taking refuge in convenient self-deception, and I cannot ignore the evidence that my brother's transformation may be genuine, or the possibility that your heart remains partially engaged by a man whose capacity for growth you helped to discover. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge that demanded response, though Gabriel continued speaking before Beatrice could find her voice to reply to observations that struck too close to fears she had been reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. "Love," he continued with the quiet authority of a man who had learned wisdom through observing both the best and worst of human nature, "should not be a consolation prize for either of us, and I would rather see you happy with Sebastian. If that is where your true feelings lie, then married to me out of obligation, gratitude, or the desire to spite a man who hurt you but may have learned better through that experience." Beatrice stared at him in shock, recognizing that Gabriel was offering her the freedom to choose her own path without the constraint of honoring an engagement that had been motivated at least partly by her need to escape from emotional confusion rather than her desire to build a life with him specifically. The generous nobility of his gesture only intensified her uncertainty, for she realized that releasing her from their commitment represented exactly the sort of selfless act that had made her respect and care for him in the first place. Yet his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for hers forced her to confront questions about the nature of love and the difference between passion and deeper forms of affection that she was not certain she possessed the wisdom to answer correctly. The dissolution of her engagement to Gabriel provided Beatrice with the freedom she had unconsciously craved, yet the weight of that liberty proved far heavier than the constraints of her previous commitment, forcing her to confront emotions and desires she had been able to avoid examining while safely bound by obligation to a man whose character offered sanctuary from uncertainty. The announcement that Lady Beatrice Ashworth and Lord Gabriel Blackwood had mutually agreed to end their betrothal, citing incompatible expectations regarding their future together, sent fresh waves of speculation through London society. Though Gabriel's insistence that the decision reflected no discredit upon either party, and his continued public expressions of respect for Beatrice's character helped minimize the scandal that might otherwise have destroyed her reputation entirely. Within days of the announcement, Beatrice found herself overwhelmed by the well-meaning advice of friends and family members, each offering their own interpretation of recent events and their recommendations for how she should proceed, until the cacophony of opinions became unbearable and she resolved to seek the solitude necessary for honest self-examination. Lady Margaret, recognizing her daughter's need for retreat from the pressures and expectations of society, suggested a sojourn at Willowbrook, the family's modest country estate in Derbyshire, where Beatrice could enjoy the peace and natural beauty that had always provided her with clarity during times of emotional turmoil. The invitation was extended to include Cordelia, whose friendship had sustained Beatrice through every crisis of her adult life, and whose practical wisdom could be relied upon to cut through romantic confusion with the efficiency of a well-honed blade. The two young women departed London on a crisp morning in early May, their carriage loaded with books and correspondence that would occupy their time during what promised to be an extended period of reflection and decision-making. Though Beatrice suspected that no amount of rational analysis would entirely resolve the conflict between her heart's desires and her mind's assessment of what constituted prudent choices for her future happiness. Willowbrook's gardens provided the perfect setting for the long walks that became a daily ritual during Beatrice's retreat from society, the estate's informal landscaping and wildflower meadows offering a stark contrast to the manicured perfection of London's parks and the constant awareness of being observed and judged that characterized metropolitan social life. During these rambles, Cordelia proved herself an invaluable companion, listening to Beatrice's confused recounting of recent events with the patience of a confessor, and the insight of someone who had witnessed the entire drama from its inception. Her questions designed not to influence her friend's conclusions, but rather to encourage the thorough examination of feelings and motivations that would be necessary for any lasting resolution of her romantic dilemma. "Tell me honestly," Cordelia said during one particularly beautiful afternoon as they paused beside a stream that wound through the property's lower meadows, "when you imagine yourself 5 years from now, married and settled with children of your own, which man appears in that vision naturally, without conscious effort to place him there?" Beatrice considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, closing her eyes to block out external distractions as she allowed her mind to drift toward the future she hoped to create, and found herself surprised by the immediate clarity of the image that emerged from her subconscious thoughts. Sebastian appeared in her mental picture with such vividness that she could almost see the silver threading through his dark hair and the way his blue eyes would light up when he looked at their children, his natural charisma tempered by the wisdom and responsibility that age and experience would bring to his character. The vision felt so real and so right that opening her eyes and returning to present reality required a conscious effort that left her feeling disoriented and strangely bereft, as though she had been forced to abandon a future that belonged to her by right, but remained tantalizingly out of reach due to circumstances beyond her control. "I see Sebastian," she admitted quietly, her voice carrying a note of surprise that suggested she had not expected such a definitive answer to emerge from her confused thoughts. Even now, after everything that has happened between us, after the pain and betrayal, and the knowledge of how our acquaintance began, when I imagine true happiness and complete contentment, he is there beside me, changed by experience, but fundamentally the same man whose intelligence and passion first captured my attention despite my every effort to remain indifferent to his considerable charms. Cordelia nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose intuition had been confirmed by careful observation, her expression gentle but determined, as she prepared to voice truths that might prove difficult for Beatrice to hear, despite their necessity. "You care for Gabriel deeply, sir," she said with the directness that characterized her approach to emotional complexities, "and your respect for his character is both genuine and well-founded. But your feelings for him are those of warm friendship rather than the sort of passionate love that should unite husband and wife for the duration of their natural lives. Gabriel deserves a woman who will see him as the most fascinating and attractive man in any room, not someone who appreciates his many virtues while secretly yearning for the excitement and intensity that only his brother can provide." The observation struck Beatrice with the force of revelation, illuminating aspects of her engagement that she had been reluctant to examine too closely, and she realized that Cordelia had identified the fundamental flaw in her relationship with Gabriel that made their eventual separation inevitable regardless of Sebastian's involvement in the situation. "You are right," she said simply, her voice heavy with the weight of finally acknowledging what her heart had known from the beginning, despite her rational mind's arguments in favor of security and compatibility. "I convinced myself that respect and friendship provided a more solid foundation for marriage than passion and uncertainty, but I was attempting to settle for a pale imitation of what love should be, rather than risking everything for the genuine article. Gabriel recognized this truth before I was willing to admit it myself, and his decision to release me from our engagement represented an act of love that honored both our futures more than maintaining a commitment that would have satisfied neither of our deepest needs. The conversation continued as they walked back toward the house, Beatrice's understanding of her own heart growing clearer with each step, until she felt ready to confront the remaining obstacles that separated her from the future she truly wanted, regardless of the challenges and uncertainties that choice might entail. The news of Sebastian's accident reached Willowbrook through a messenger dispatched by the Earl of Ashworth, who had received word from Lady Margaret that the Duke of Ravensholm had been seriously injured when his curricle overturned during a wild dash from London to his Gloucestershire estate, where he had planned to meet with his steward about implementing extensive reforms to benefit his tenant families. The letter provided few details about the extent of his injuries, noting only that he remained unconscious and that the physicians expressed concern about potential complications from a severe blow to his head that might prove life-threatening if proper treatment was not maintained consistently. Beatrice read the communication twice before its full implications penetrated her consciousness, and when the reality of Sebastian's condition finally registered, she felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet, leaving her struggling to maintain her balance in the face of a terror she had never imagined possible. The thought that Sebastian might die before she could tell him that she understood the genuineness of his transformation, that she forgave his initial deception, and that she loved him with a completeness that frightened her with its intensity, sent her into a state of panic that made rational thought almost impossible until Cordelia's calm voice penetrated her hysteria with practical suggestions about immediate action. "We must return to London immediately," Cordelia announced with the decisive authority that made her such a valuable friend during crises, and from there we shall travel to Ravensholm to ensure that you have the opportunity to speak with Sebastian before it is too late, regardless of what society might think about such unconventional behavior from an unmarried lady. The proprieties that normally govern our conduct mean nothing when measured against the possibility of lifelong regret for words left unspoken and feelings left unexpressed. Beatrice required no further encouragement to abandon her retreat and embark upon what might prove to be the most important journey of her life, her previous uncertainty replaced by a clarity of purpose that eliminated every consideration except the desperate need to reach Sebastian's side before circumstances made such a reunion impossible. The journey from Derbyshire to Gloucestershire required 2 grueling days of travel, with Beatrice and Cordelia taking turns managing the arrangements for fresh horses and brief stops for refreshment, while maintaining a pace that tested both their endurance and the limits of what their hired conveyance could sustain over rough country roads. Beatrice spent the long hours staring out at the countryside, rolling past their windows while her mind raced through memories of every conversation she had shared with Sebastian, searching for signs of the genuine feeling he claimed to have developed beneath his initial calculating pursuit of entertainment at her expense, and finding evidence that she had been too wounded by his deception to recognize at the time. His letter, which she had brought with her and read repeatedly during the journey, took on new meaning as she considered each carefully chosen word in light of her growing understanding of her own heart, and she began to appreciate the courage it had required for a man of his pride to expose his vulnerability so completely without any guarantee that his honesty would be met with anything other than continued rejection. When their carriage finally turned through the gates of Ravensholm, Beatrice felt her heart hammering against her ribs with an intensity that made breathing difficult, her anxiety about Sebastian's condition warring with uncertainty about how her unexpected arrival would be received by a man who had every reason to believe she despised him for his role in destroying her engagement to his brother. The great house loomed before them in the fading light of early evening, its imposing facade softened by the golden glow that spilled from numerous windows, suggesting a level of activity that offered hope about Sebastian's recovery, while providing no specific information about his current condition or prognosis for complete healing. Gabriel emerged from the main entrance before their carriage had come to a complete stop, his appearance disheveled in a way that suggested he had not left his brother's side since receiving word of the accident, his expression carrying a mixture of relief at seeing Beatrice and concern about the circumstances that had brought her to Ravensholm at such a critical moment. "Beatrice," he said simply as he helped her down from the carriage, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion, "I am grateful that you came, though I confess uncertainty about what motivated your decision to make such a difficult journey under these circumstances." She met his eyes directly, recognizing that this conversation would determine whether she gained access to Sebastian's sick room or found herself turned away from the threshold of the future she desperately wanted to claim. "Gabriel," she replied with a steadiness that surprised her given the circumstances, "I came because I realized that if Sebastian dies without knowing that I love him, despite everything that has passed between us, I will never forgive myself for allowing pride and wounded feelings to prevent me from acknowledging the truth that my heart has known since almost the beginning of our acquaintance." Gabriel studied her face with the careful attention he had always brought to important decisions, and she could see the moment when he recognized the complete sincerity of her declaration, his expression shifting from wariness to something that might have been relief, mixed with a sadness that spoke to his own sacrifice in releasing her from their engagement. "Come, then," he said quietly, leading her toward the house with the resigned grace of a man who had accepted that love could not be commanded or controlled regardless of merit or deserving. He has been calling for you in his delirium, and perhaps your voice will provide the anchor his spirit needs to find its way back to consciousness and the possibility of recovery. As they climbed the grand staircase toward Sebastian's chambers, Beatrice felt as though she were ascending toward either the fulfillment of every dream she had never dared to acknowledge, or the destruction of hopes she had finally found the courage to embrace, her future hanging in the balance of whatever awaited her in the room where the man she loved fought for his life while calling her name in the darkness of unconsciousness. The wedding of Lady Beatrice Ashworth to Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravensholm, took place on a crisp October morning at the village church near Willowbrook, the intimate setting chosen deliberately to reflect the transformation both bride and groom had undergone during their tumultuous courtship from scandal to genuine affection. The ceremony bore no resemblance to the grand spectacle that Sebastian might once have orchestrated to display his social prominence and secure his position as London's most envied bridegroom, instead embodying the quiet elegance and sincere emotion that characterized their relationship after surviving the trials of deception, separation, and near tragedy. The church itself, built of honey-colored stone that glowed warmly in the autumn sunlight, provided a perfect backdrop for vows that acknowledged both the unconventional nature of their romance and the deep love that had emerged from circumstances that might have destroyed less resilient hearts, while the small gathering of family and close friends who witnessed their union represented only those whose affection for the couple was genuine rather than merely socially motivated. Gabriel stood beside his brother as best man, his presence serving as living testament to the power of forgiveness and family bonds that could survive even the most challenging circumstances, his own recent engagement to Miss Cordelia Fairfax having provided him with the happiness he deserved after his generous sacrifice for his brother's welfare. The sight of Gabriel supporting Sebastian during this most important moment of his life moved many witnesses to tears, as they recognized the profound love between brothers who had learned to value each other's happiness above their own desires. Their relationship strengthened rather than weakened by the romantic complications that had tested their loyalty and mutual respect. Beatrice approached the altar wearing a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to her grandmother, its simple elegance enhanced by a veil of Brussels lace that caught the light streaming through the church's stained glass windows, her appearance radiant, not merely because of her natural beauty, but due to the joy and certainty that illuminated her features as she prepared to pledge herself to a man whose love she had earned through adversity rather than received as tribute to her social position or family connections. Sebastian waited at the altar with an expression of wonder that suggested he still could hardly believe his good fortune in securing the hand of a woman whose character had challenged him to become worthy of her regard, his usual confidence replaced by a humility that made him appear younger and more approachable than the arrogant duke who had first appeared at Almack's with conquest rather than courtship in mind. When Beatrice reached his side and placed her hand in his, the electricity that had always sparked between them transformed into something deeper and more lasting, their physical attraction now supported by mutual respect and genuine understanding that promised to sustain them through whatever challenges marriage might present. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, though both bride and groom had insisted upon personalizing their vows to reflect the unique journey that had brought them together, their words carefully chosen to acknowledge past mistakes while affirming their commitment to building a future based upon honesty, trust, and the kind of deep affection that grows stronger under pressure rather than wilting at the first sign of difficulty. When Sebastian spoke his vows, his voice carried none of the practiced smoothness that had once characterized his romantic pronouncements, instead revealing the genuine emotion of a man who understood that he was receiving a gift he had not earned through his initial conduct, but had been granted through mercy and the transformative power of authentic love. Beatrice," he said with quiet intensity that reached every corner of the small church, "I stand before God, and these witnesses not as the man who first approached you with calculated intention to prove my superiority in matters of the heart, but as someone you have taught to value sincerity over strategy and genuine feeling over temporary conquest. You have shown me what it means to love someone completely, without reservation or ulterior motive, and I promise to spend the remainder of my days proving worthy of the trust you place in me today." Beatrice's response carried equal weight of meaning, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to overwhelm her, as she acknowledged both Sebastian's transformation and her own growth from impulsive rebellion to mature understanding of what constituted lasting happiness in marriage and life. "Sebastian," she began, her hazel eyes fixed upon his face with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade into insignificance. "When I first kissed you at Almack's, I intended only to shock you and perhaps teach you that not every woman would succumb to your legendary charm without resistance. I never imagined that my gesture of defiance would begin a journey that would teach me the difference between passion and love, between excitement and genuine contentment, and between the man you appeared to be and the man you were capable of becoming. You have shown me that redemption is possible for anyone willing to acknowledge their faults and work toward improvement, and I promise to love and support you as you continue to grow into the husband, father, and leader I know you can be." The exchange of rings followed, the simple gold bands serving as symbols of commitment that required no elaborate ornamentation to convey their significance. And when the rector pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss sealed not merely a legal union, but the culmination of a love story that had begun with scandal and survived every obstacle that pride, misunderstanding, and external interference could place in its path. The reception that followed took place in the gardens of Willowbrook, where tables laden with autumn flowers and seasonal delicacies provided a feast that celebrated abundance in simplicity rather than ostentation. The atmosphere relaxed and joyful in a way that reflected the genuine affection shared by all present, rather than the formal obligations that characterized many fashionable weddings. Gabriel's toast to the newlyweds captured the essence of their remarkable journey from initial antagonism to deep love, his words carrying both humor and sincere emotion as he reflected upon the lessons their courtship had provided about the unpredictable nature of human feeling and the possibility of finding happiness in the most unlikely circumstances. To Sebastian and Beatrice, he said, raising his glass while his eyes sparkled with affection for both his brother and new sister, who have proven that love can indeed conquer all obstacles when it is based upon genuine respect and the willingness to grow beyond our original limitations. Their story reminds us that first impressions, however dramatic, need not determine final outcomes, and that the heart often recognizes what the mind takes much longer to accept. May your marriage continue to demonstrate that the most unconventional beginnings can lead to the most satisfying conclusions when both parties possess the courage to remain open to transformation and the wisdom to value character over reputation. The celebration continued into the early evening, with dancing and conversation that allowed family and friends to express their joy in the couple's happiness, while also acknowledging the remarkable way their union had brought together various relationships that might otherwise never have formed, including Gabriel's own courtship of Cordelia, whose practical wisdom had provided crucial support during the most difficult periods of recent months. 1 year later, the drawing room at Ravensholm House presented a scene of domestic tranquility that would have amazed anyone who remembered the dramatic events that had preceded the current state of marital bliss, as Beatrice sat at her writing desk composing correspondence related to the charitable foundation she had established to support education for young women whose circumstances prevented them from receiving the intellectual development their abilities deserved. Sebastian worked nearby, reviewing reports from his estate managers about the improvements that had transformed Ravensholm from a neglected inheritance into a model of progressive agricultural practice and tenant welfare. His commitment to responsible stewardship having surprised many observers who had expected his marriage to represent the extent of his reformation rather than merely its beginning. The changes in both their characters had deepened rather than diminished over the months of marriage, as they discovered that the process of building a life together required constant attention to each other's needs and aspirations, their initial attraction having evolved into a partnership that combined passion with practical cooperation and mutual support for individual as well as shared goals. Gabriel's marriage to Cordelia had taken place in spring, their wedding serving as proof that patient courtship and genuine compatibility could produce happiness every bit as satisfying as the more dramatic romance that had captured society's attention the previous year. Their union characterized by the quiet contentment that came from two people who appreciated each other's virtues without requiring constant excitement to maintain their interest and affection. The brothers now worked together on various projects related to their estates and charitable endeavors, their relationship having been strengthened rather than damaged by the romantic complications that had tested their loyalty and forced them to examine their priorities with greater clarity than either might have achieved under more conventional circumstances. The afternoon quiet was interrupted by the arrival of Gabriel and Cordelia, accompanied by their infant son and several pieces of correspondence that required Sebastian's attention regarding the Veterans Foundation that had become one of his primary occupations outside his ducal responsibilities. The work providing him with genuine satisfaction that had nothing to do with social recognition and everything to do with the knowledge that his efforts made real differences in the lives of men who had served their country with honor but received little support upon their return to civilian life. As the four adults settled into comfortable conversation about family matters and charitable business, Beatrice found herself reflecting upon the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed her life so completely, beginning with a moment of pure impulse that had seemed at the time like nothing more than an amusing way to deflate masculine arrogance, but had ultimately led to discoveries about love, forgiveness, and personal growth that continued to surprise her with their depth and complexity. Sometimes, she mused while watching Sebastian discuss agricultural improvements with his brother, the most scandalous choices lead to the most perfect endings, though never in the way we imagine when we first step onto paths that seem to promise nothing more than temporary entertainment or minor revenge against those who underestimate our intelligence and independence. The observation proved prophetic as Sebastian looked up from his papers and caught her eye across the room, their shared glance carrying layers of meaning that encompassed gratitude for their unlikely journey together, amusement at the dramatic circumstances that had brought them to such happiness, and the deep understanding that comes from two people who have learned to love each other not despite their flaws, but because of their willingness to grow beyond those limitations for the sake of building something beautiful and lasting together. The kiss that had changed everything at Almack's had indeed led to a lifetime of kisses freely given and received, each one representing not conquest or surrender, but the ongoing choice to cherish and be cherished by someone whose love had been earned through adversity and would be sustained through whatever challenges the future might present, to test their commitment to each other and the family they had begun to create together.